The rumors of Apple's demise have been greatly exaggerated by me several times over. Apple might not be the company they were when Steve Jobs was alive, but in the last year or so, they've turned a corner and began to move away from being tone deaf to their customers' needs and turned into a company that seems to be finding its way back to its roots. As I've said in many videos up to this point, the Apple that won me over as a customer was the underdog Apple that went up against the big companies like IBM and later Microsoft. The Apple that won me over as a customer mirrored the personality of the guy who willed it into being, Steve Jobs. Stubborn, combative, egotistical, visionary, iconoclastic, while still putting the design and use of the devices his company created before the bottom line. The Apple of Steve Jobs both innovated and elevated tech in a way that can only be compared to the advent of the printing press, the invention of the telephone. It changed the way that we make and consume art and live our daily lives. The Apple of Steve Jobs changed the world. You're free to argue with me, and I know some of you already are. It's all cool. But there are certain things about Apple, certain places that Apple holds in history that anybody who's being honest with themselves has to say, yeah, it's hard to argue that. But somewhere along the way, Apple sold out. And you have to understand what I mean when I say that. I grew up in the 80s where corporatism was anathema to creativity. As Apple became good at making money, I began to mistrust them. It's the 80s punk rock kid in me. Anything corporate is compromised. I've spent the last couple of decades trying to complicate that way of thinking, and with the Apple of 2019, I might be starting to get there. It would be naive to think that making money wasn't a big driving force in the success of Apple, but for a while they were able to be both things, the scrappy up-and-comer who was fighting for the little guy and the big giant corporation making money hand over fist. Now understand me, one thing that separates a guy like me and my historical understanding of Apple is pretty much very simple. When a lot of the younger tech pundits of today were still pooping in their diapers or playing tag at recess or popping zits in the mirror as adenoidal teenagers, I was using Apple products. And using those products was central to who I am today. I wouldn't be who I am without Apple as part of my life. I know firsthand how Apple went from being the company that made computers for creatives to the company that was almost dead, to the company that came back to life and revolutionized computing again with the iMac, to the company that put 1,000 songs in your pocket, and then the company that revolutionized the telephone and more. Quite simply, what makes me different is I was there. That's why after Steve Jobs died, I was trepidatious. I worried that the Apple I loved couldn't exist without a visionary like him at the helm. I knew Tim Cook was good at his job. I knew Steve Jobs wouldn't choose him to succeed if he wasn't a good choice. Take a look back at the post-Steve Jobs Apple for a moment and think about how long it's taken them to find their footing now. Their first foray was the trash can Mac Pro. It was an abortive attempt at innovation that ended up being an albatross around the company's neck for 7 years. There was the iPhone 6 and Bendgate. And then there was the removal of the headphone jack. More recently, we've got the notch, the overheating MacBook Pros, hell, the USB-C MacBooks in general are something to talk about. Batterygate, there have been issues. I could go on, and I have, but you get the point. The post-Steve Jobs Apple was in many ways a shadow of itself in the years since his death. I was critical. I was frustrated. I was, if I'm being honest, a little scared that Apple would cease to be a company I could rely on to support me in the various things that I do in the way that Apple had for so long. Sure, I've used PCs extensively in my life, and there are a ton of Android phones out there that I love, but in a world without Apple, or just a world with a zombie Apple going through the motions and scraping up whatever cash they could before the bottom dropped out, now that to me was a scary and somewhat aggravating proposition. And since 2016, I was pretty sure that Apple was the new Apple. In 2017, they removed the headphone jack from the iPhones, and that was the first big step away from Steve's Apple to this other Apple. One that seemed to cynically take things away from customers while charging them more for the privilege. The removal of the headphone jack coming soon after they purchased the biggest headphone company in the world smacked of planned obsolescence and quite literally just opportunism. I could see them in the back room saying, take away their headphone jacks, and then they have to buy something new, something that we will make. The fact that AirPods were that product that Apple would make is, I guess, a perfect segue into where I think Apple started to turn the corner. Sometime in late 2016, early 2017, as they were at their lowest, that was the year they released the iPhone X, which was a divisive device for many reasons. The notch, the $1,000 price tag, chief among them. But again, that was the year the AirPods started to take on momentum. I've gone on record as saying the AirPods aren't great headphones, but they are convenient to a level that no other wireless headphone before or actually since has ever been. They sound good enough for most people, and they're super convenient. And if I really make a confession, I use AirPods probably 75% of the time, even though I'm snobby. The iMac Pro came out in 2017, and that was the first pro-level computing device Apple had released that didn't make compromises. Yes, there were no user upgradable parts, but at least the parts that were in there weren't years behind the rest of the competition and still not user upgradable. It was and still is a very good product. iPad Pros, another example, as are the Mac Minis and the iPhone XR. They straddle that line between fantastic product that makes the right compromises and not a crippled version of the product that's no use to its consumer. It finally came together for me after watching this year's iPhone event. I saw a little bit of compromise from Apple, both in price and in build. The new iPhones aren't groundbreaking, but if early reviews can be trusted, they are very good phones. And yes, they're stupid expensive at the high end, but they're also super reasonably priced down at the lower end. That didn't happen last year. That hasn't happened in years before, and it really, really bothered me. It was symptomatic of what I thought Apple was becoming, or had become. The Apple of 2019 isn't dead. It isn't dying. It's not the Apple that Steve Jobs built, but it's also not a cynical corporate beast that doesn't care about its customers. It's both good enough for most people, but yet still great for the people who have been with them for years, for the people who have relied on them for their livelihoods. Yes, we can argue 1,000 small points about this, that, or the other thing, and everything is not rosy. But whereas a few years ago, I feared the Apple I both loved and needed was gone for good, now it's not the Apple of Steve Jobs, it's not the Apple of Tim Cook, it's an Apple that has turned the corner from being those things and is becoming something else. And that something else seems to me like it's going to be a lot better for its customers.